Hi! I know it's the last talk of the day, so I definitely need to come at this with a lot of energy because you've been sitting down and listening all day long. So hopefully you've had some interesting thoughts and your mind has been provoked, and I'm hopefully going to provoke it a little bit further. But this isn't going to be me just talking at you for 45 more minutes. Actually, we need to start the timer. Probably a good thing, right? Let's make sure we do that. I tweeted earlier that I wasn't kidding. I was going to talk about socks and innovation. So let's talk about socks. How many of you buy socks in odd numbers? Raise your hand. I'm gonna look for. This is the last talk. You gotta be with me here. You buy them in odd numbers or odd pairs? So if you buy 3 pairs, right, that's 6. That's not an odd number. How many of you buy them in threes? Think it's a good idea? Is this like a $5 million business idea? Would you invest in this?
Not really.
You wouldn't invest in it? No? Anyone else here invest in this? Yes? No? I don't see a lot of people raising their hands saying, yes, I want to invest in a $5 million or more idea on selling socks in threes. But here's the thing. What if I told you they didn't match? Would that up the stakes? So not only 3 socks, but 3 socks that don't match. Is that even more valuable or less valuable? What do you think? More valuable? No. You're kind of shaking here like, what are you, nuts? Yes. You would do this. Excellent. Why? Tell me why.
You get one more to repair or to match.
So you got a spare part, like you're selling the spare, right? It's actually a pretty good idea because what happened in 2004, a guy named Jonas Stahl was sitting around a bar in San Francisco with a couple of his friends, and they were kind of wondering, why is it that the dryer seems to eat one of my socks? And then I end up with this extra sock. It's kind of like, huh. And so they were laughing about it over a beer, but then they kind of started thinking about it a little bit more like, well, yeah, what if we did sell socks in threes? I mean, most people, I shouldn't say all people, most people have 2 feet, so they only need 2 socks, or 2 at a time. But he thought about it even further, and he was a program manager at a design agency called Frog Design in San Francisco. So because he had a creative bent to him, he and his colleagues started something called Little Mismatched. Little Mismatched went on to become a runaway success. That $5 million became $25 million in 3 years. So by, I think, 2007, 2008. Jonah was working at a design agency, but he ended up starting this and leaving. My question to you is, how come Zara or H&M or Gap Kids, how come they didn't do this? Wildly successful. It's now got, I think, over 100 million in revenue. Why didn't they do this? All right? You would have invested. You wouldn't have. Right? So why? This is the question that I always ask myself. Like, okay, Zara and H&M, some of the largest clothing manufacturers in the world, they have tons of resources to put behind an effort like this, yet they don't. This is always I'm curious about. There's lots of things that happen like this in organizations. Plenty of other stories out there. Right? And we hear about it every single day that companies are facing disruption, left, right, and center. I'll briefly talk about disruptive innovation and theories of disruptive innovation. Hopefully you have at least some sense of what this is. There's, according to Clay Christensen, there's really a couple types. There's a low market entry, where somebody comes in and they compete at the low end of the market, lower price point, lower tier, maybe not quite as many features, and that's how they steal market share. And then you have somebody creating an entire new market, right? So that you have low-end and high-end disruption, or low-end and new market disruptions. And an example of low-end might be like your SSD hard drives. When they first started out, they were really expensive, so they weren't low in terms of cost. They were low in terms of performance. They might have been faster, but they were really expensive, and they kind of broke a lot. They didn't last as long as the spinning disk hard drives. They eventually got there, but the first few entries to market, not so great. Or maybe some of the lower cost airlines like JetBlue and EasyJet. And if you're familiar with JetBlue, a US low cost carrier, is now starting to move up market. They're they started out like, hey, no first class. Everybody's the same. And last year, they just announced that on their long-haul flights from coast to coast in the US, they're going to start offering Mint, which is first class. So they start out the low end of the market and slowly eat their way in. United Airlines, I'm from Boston, United Airlines used to own all of Terminal C. If you go to Terminal C today, it's almost all JetBlue. And this happened over the course of 10 years. So disruption doesn't necessarily happen overnight. New market disruptions are something like Zipcar. There wasn't really a sharing, a small car rental economy. There was car rental, but there wasn't car rental for an hour or an hour and a half. Or Airbnb, renting somebody's own apartment. Taking substitutes that don't necessarily directly compete, but they still compete in a different way. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So a couple case studies you can think about, like, all right, well, if Jonah kind of got lucky and did something, well, that wasn't a digital product. A lot of people here write and create digital products. Anyone here of Color? Color.com? Yes. What happened with Color? A lot of money and no product, right? Exactly. Bill Nguyen, he was a fairly well-known San Francisco entrepreneur. And he, I think $41 million is what he ultimately had for investment, put this app out to market and didn't go anywhere at all. He ended up checking out, then he ended up shutting down. And partly because when you looked back at what he did was this a bit formulaic, was that, well, he raised some venture backing, initially 14 million, became a little bit more. He hired a bunch of really good engineers. These were not stupid people. These are some of Silicon Valley's best engineers. Some of the people came from Apple. He put a great space together, and then he said, hopefully they'll make something, valuable. He may have had a vision, but the vision was much more about creating a technology, creating something interesting from a technology perspective. He wasn't interested in creating something from a human perspective. He kept saying, I want to create a really interesting technology. It's going to be built on Facebook. Facebook's the new operating system. Well, if you're just looking out to build a technology, you may not be solving anything interesting for people. Another guy who tried to do this is Ben Kaufman, and he was written up left, right, and center about being the innovator. He solved the innovator's dilemma. He solved it. However, a few years later, Quirky didn't quite have a business model that worked, and they shut down. So these are entrepreneurs that are seasoned. Both Ben and Bill were seasoned entrepreneurs. Jonah was not. Interesting. And they had venture capital, they had advice, they had good talent, but they couldn't get something to work. So what happened in those organizations what was the dynamics going on inside that organization where things failed? One last case study. We're going to roll the clock back to the mid-1980s. You may have heard of a company called General Motors. General Motors was struggling. They were making trucks really, really well for a long time. They were struggling with the small car segment. And they had this manufacturing site in Fremont, California. Now, General Motors is in Detroit, Michigan, if you know much about the geography of the United States. Detroit is kind of in the middle, a little bit towards the east. Fremont, California is way on the other side of the country, pretty far away. This Fremont, California plant was horrible. They were putting Coke bottles inside the doors. They were putting a front end of one car onto the back end of another car. So many defects. And the incentives for the workers, well, that was a good thing because that meant they would get overtime to go fix them. Which, hey, great for them, right? So you're wondering how come nobody got fired? And part of it was because all the union and labor contracts were written by the unions that were led in Detroit, and they weren't really representing much of the factories or much of the workers in Fremont, California. So GM noticed this, didn't really do much about it until sometime in the mid-'80s, and Toyota had famously opened up their kimono, so to speak. They said, come on over. If anyone wants to learn from us, learn the Toyota way, we will teach you. How strange is that? Would you open your company's doors and say, hey, Mr. Competitor, come on over inside. We'll teach you everything you can about how we operate. Would you do that? Would anyone do that? You're shaking your head. You're like, no way, I wouldn't do that. Well, GM, I think, was the one who declared bankruptcy in 2009 or 2010, right? It wasn't Toyota. So which one was the better decision? Well, they joined forces, and GM said, we have this really bad plant in Fremont, California. Can you do something with it? Toyota said, sure. How many of you would have fired everybody from Fremont, given what I told you? People were drinking on the job. Literally, there's reports of people drinking and having sex and just really like horrible, doing crazy things. So you'd fire everybody. You would? Okay. Who wouldn't fire anybody? There's nobody here who wouldn't fire anybody. So here's what Toyota said. Toyota said, nope, we're going to keep everybody. You're like, what? Right? What are you, crazy? They said, yep. We'll bring them over. They trained a lot of people in Japan. They said, come over to Japan. We're going to train you how we do things. You need to see how we operate. So they brought them over, trained them, and this is this new United Motor Manufacturing. And what happened is, in a matter of a couple years, that Fremont plant went from being the worst performing organization in GM's ecosystem to one of the best, because they embraced the Toyota way. Part of it was a lot of things like the andon cord, being able to stop when a bolt didn't work. What they did was push down, and if I could spend an hour talking just about the Toyota way and how lean, and we've heard lean a few times here. Where do you think that comes from? It comes from Toyota and manufacturing. The reduction of waste, pushing decisions down to lower levels as possible. So a lot of people might say, well, it's the talent. You got to have the talent. A lot of people will say, no, it's the product. You got to be working on a good product. A lot of people say it's the environment, the space. Well, NUMMI, it's the same exact manufacturing facility, the same exact products they were making a couple years beforehand, and the same exact people. It was just the approach of how they actually decided to operate. They started to operate in a more human-centered fashion, I would argue. So GM, being GM, and thinking this is really good, but then how do I get this, NUMMI, how do I get that to the rest across my business? Well, that was hard. They had another plant in Van Nuys, California that they tried to implement this, but it wouldn't work. Partly because the people at Fremont were actually officially got laid off and then got hired back, as the story goes. The people in Van Nuys, they just never thought they'd get fired. They're like, oh, we're just going to go to this training thing and things going to happen, and everything's going to be fine. And it didn't work that way. So there was no sense of urgency on their part to actually adopt and embrace this new change because their jobs weren't on the line. So again, misaligned incentives. So the thought was to make this happen, but it didn't. Now we see this in other areas. We see this happening a lot today. We see this in a lot of corporate innovation centers. We see it at CVS Health, Fidelity Labs, Capital One is a bank, Walmart, there's so many of them. And I know I'm guilty because I used to work for one. I spent 3 years working at Constant Contact's Innovation Loft in Boston. And what we did there was try to do exactly that, to create new products and to help the existing organization, which was a actually close to a 20-year-old tech company that started in the 90s. They were email marketing, so you may have heard of MailChimp, a competitor. How do we kickstart and reshape that organization to come into the 21st century? So we did a lot of the things that a lot of textbooks say to do and a lot of other case studies. And we put in a horizon planning process of what's innovative ideas, what are core ideas, how do we actually put this process in place, and started to slowly evangelize that across the organization. So we did product development with this horizon process. We had a startup accelerator. We brought in startups that were specifically in our area. We were small business focused, so we were more horizontal than vertical. So we brought in a bunch of startups. And we had something else called an innovation services, which is where I'll head up. How do we help the rest of the organization and the startups get better at their jobs and do things better? So we were a little bit like the SWAT team from Toyota teaching everyone how to do this. Similar kind of thing. And it slowly started working, but it didn't happen overnight. It took years. Unfortunately, Constant Contact has been acquired by another company, and they're going to shut the Innovation Loft down. The good news is they've decided to adopt some of the practices across their organization. So you could argue corporate accelerator good, but maybe not. But there was a lasting impact, which was great. The one sad part was we weren't ever allowed to fully develop a product that we had designs to develop a product for. So we had a few ideas of bringing a product to market that ultimately kept getting squashed by the senior management. Oh, no, we can't do that. That's going to hurt this business. Right? And that's what happens here is you get something new that threatens your core business, the innovation antibodies take over. No, you can't do that. It's going to harm this over here. This is a $25 million business. That's only $250,000 of revenue. We can't let that grow. That's going to hurt this. When that happens, that's a big sign of the corporate innovation antibody. So there's a lot of organizational factors that come into play. And we're going to think now a little bit about how organizations are structured to actually make this happen. So if you think about this long scale, we look historically over how companies have been. Management 1.0, back when women couldn't vote and colonialism, early 1900s, the average lifespan of the S&P was 67 years. Let's fast forward to today, right? 15 years. We start seeing this rise of a new type of company that's more designed for innovation, started with digital change agents and venture design, and sort of designing the venture, being human-centered. And then even a third type of company started coming up as well. So this research was done by colleagues of mine at Explain. They're a consultancy that focuses on organizational development and organizational change. And they noticed these three different types, sort of a traditional hierarchical organization, oftentimes the manufacturing organization. A lot of the way we work today has roots in manufacturing. It was show up, do this process, get results, because it was very physical labor, and that's slowly changing. Some of the newer organizations came with a more conscious approach. How do we be more value-driven? How do we think more about humans and how they work? And then a third one, I call the modern organization, is much more organic, much more agile, much more of a digital native type of organization. So let's look at each of them. The first one, the traditional organization, they're very mission-driven. We're going to do this thing. We're going to put a computer in every household. We're going to bring a person to the moon and back. That sort of very mission there. Once you've achieved the mission, once you've achieved your goal, then what? But it's very authoritarian. It's very hierarchical, and it's very, very structured. These are often very, very large organizations. Then you've got a more conscious organization, very values-driven. Right? Maybe I had some examples. Maybe after the end I'll talk about those. So each one, the hierarchy is a little bit different, right? The individual judgment is in a different spot. And the modern organization is typically led by purpose. Here the examples are. So you can think the traditional ones like BP, think of the large organizations, Exxon, IBM, Oracle, a lot of these hierarchical organizations. Then you've got something like Patagonia, where they're actually so value-driven that they will give away their IP to their competitors if it means living up to their values. And they'll actually give it away because their values about environment and environmental safety and environmental preservation, if it means that their supply chain IP is going to help the rest of the industry, they'll give that away for free because that holds to their values. And you could think about something like a much more purpose-driven organization like Airbnb or perhaps Zappos. Zappos is driven to delight the customer. That's why they exist, delight the customer in their retail purchases. Right? And so the question that I'm curious about is this an evolution? Is this some kind of evolution? If a Airbnb starts like this and then grows over time, do they ultimately become like this? Because what happens when a company grows is you get really good at making your product or service, and then the incentives are there to make that product or service delivery more and more efficient over time. You add more features, you clean up the back end, you do everything you can to maximize the value out of your investment in that product or service. So what happens do you always have to change? Are you always constantly changing? I think that's the big challenge with today so I think what ultimately is it's some sort of hybrid model. You have to be able to figure out how to keep the lights on, how to keep your existing business model functioning and working, but yet still experiment and learn and adapt to a new future. So I'll touch on a few other programmatic factors I have seen when it comes to innovation. Some of you may have heard of Adobe. Have you ever heard of their Kickbox program or Redbox program? You can get like $1,000, and if you complete everything in their program, you get the blue box, and the blue box actually means you get a dedicated team to go take your product and go do something with it. So some of their products and services that they're actually, I think, have got to market today have become part of this. We used to run innovation jams at the Interloft to try to get crowdsourced ideas really quickly. I heard an interesting, I think it was you were talking to me about the days where you pull everybody in and they watch the video and they take notes of the different bugs in your product, and then they get to spend a day fixing the bugs. Bit more of a incremental innovation, sort of cleaning up your current product, but probably spawn some new ideas for brand new products, right? And the thing that I learned, especially from the Innovation Loft, was that you've got to have top down and bottom up. It can't be mandated from the top because the people might not get it. And it can't be completely crowdsourced from the bottom. It has to come from both places. And speaking of that, how do companies allocate their resources? Do they put their money where their mouth is? I overheard this at a conference. I couldn't take down the guy's name. I was trying to figure it out. But so I asked him, do you set aside 20% of your time and resources? Do you actually do this? Or are you just giving lip service to this? And there's some interesting data from Innovation Leader who talks about where are they actually trying to get, allocate their resources? And are they actually allocating it to training? And who's been trained in their organization? This graph I find more interesting. Only a small percentage are trained in innovation approaches, innovation methods. And one of the things about this, being a designer, is do companies value design? I think design we're seeing more and more design proliferating across larger organizations because they're realizing the value of design. Tom Watson famously said, good design is good business. Indra hired a chief design officer a few years ago. And so where is design in your organization? Where do you value it on the design ladder? Is it company-wide and you're using design as strategy? Or is it just as styling? Like, where are you on this ladder? You could be at the bottom, you could be at the top. Where are you, and how do you go to the next rung? And once you've got design as strategy, then you're probably going to do pretty well. Most companies that do have that have done well. I don't have the graph in here, but there was a study by DMI that talked about how design-led companies outperformed the S&P 500 by something like 168%. Don't quote me on the number, I probably have it wrong. And the other thing that design-led companies do is they're brutally honest, and they find ways to bake this into their culture. Anyone recognize this guy? Anyone ever see the movie Bugs or Cars? Or anyone see anything by Pixar? Yeah, so Ed Catmull started Pixar. And what he does is now obviously Pixar hires very talented designers and artists. Hello, how are you? So Ed forces his designers and artists who are very proud of their work to show their work every single day. Austin, how would you feel about showing work that's unfinished?
Uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable, right? How do we feel when we were asked to show stuff that's not done? We're always a little nervous about it, like, but he forces his team to do that and get that out of the way. That creates a brutal honesty about how good or how bad your work is. And that means you're going to make it better. I was doing a workshop just yesterday in France with a very large company, and I had them do something called ritual descent, which is they had to sketch out a solution, present it in less than a minute, and then turn around, and the rest of their team spent the next 5 minutes telling them why that solution was the worst design and solution ever. And here's the thing, they couldn't respond. They couldn't look at them. They couldn't look them in the face or anything. They just had to sit there and listen. And they had to take the feedback. And I asked them, how do they typically critique things? And I said, how long would this debating around this would have taken. They said, oh, that would have taken about 2 hours of meeting time. I said, we did this in 15 minutes. So being brutally honest and being okay with it and finding ways to pull that into your organization is really helpful. The last thing from an organizational perspective is what tools are you using? Are you using 21st century tools? If you had surgery, would you feel comfortable walking into a room and seeing 1950s surgical tools? I wouldn't be, right? So let's not use some of the tools for old business models. Let's use tools for new business models, like the business model canvas, value proposition canvas. Some of these were designed here in Europe with Alex Osterwalder. Are you rating roadmaps? So product road mapping, prioritization, do you have those tools? And are you applying them in a way that's going to help you drive to new solutions? And the last thing is individually. We'll cover sort of individual elements of what we're doing. And this is where the 3 papers come in. So you've got 3 sheets of paper, if you don't already. She has some she can get you. I want you to build the tallest tower in 3 minutes or less. Okay, ready? Go. You got 3 minutes. Start working on it.
You have to stand on the floor?
All I'm going to tell you is you have 3 minutes to build the tallest tower. There's 3 sheets of paper you've been handed. That's all I'm going to do. This is up to you to figure it out. Yeah, I bet you didn't think you would have to do this, huh? Didn't think you'd have to think a little bit. I know, cocktails are coming later. Just a little bit of activity. We'll see what happens. People are looking at me like, what? Yeah, build the tallest tower you possibly can. There's 3 sheets of paper in front of you. Halfway there.
Can I ask you questions?
Afterwards, yes. Everyone's like, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? All right, stop. All right, question. Who has the tallest tower in the room? Who does? You do. Show me how yours is the tallest tower. Because you wrote, this is the tallest. Oh, no, you wrote the biggest tower. Right? How about that one? Is that the tallest? No? How about this one? Is this one the tallest?
That's at least the longest.
It's the longest? Okay. It fell over. Okay. This one maybe? What about that one up there? That one seems to be the highest, right? So what's going on here? What's going on like when we're thinking about this? I gave you a challenge, and you all started doing something with it. Build the tallest tower in 3 minutes. You have 3 sheets of paper. What did you do? You tried to define tower. What is a tower? Is it something that lies down so I could build the tallest tower? Does it have to be freestanding? So some of you may have had questions. Some of you may have just went right to it and tried to do something. But how many of you have been under a time constraint, given a challenge to do, like build this product, do this thing under a particular time constraint? And how many of you have actually questioned what you're doing and why you're doing it? And what are the constraints around it? That type of thinking, questioning what your assumptions are. What do you assume a tower is? Did anyone here work together? No? Sometimes people turn to each other and said, hey, I'll take your 3 and my 3 and we'll put them together. They'll be 6 pages tall, right? Nobody did that. Why? Did you assume you couldn't work together? I didn't say you could or couldn't. So this is when I talk about individually thinking, what the individual mindset is. Where's my slide? Or not? Maybe? It's frozen? There we go. I got it. We're good. Is to really question the assumptions that you have and question and challenge the problem you've been tasked to solve, right? And I call this being a designist. Now I'm a little biased here because my undergrad is in biology and I went to grad school for design, so I'm a little bit of both. But you need to be an empathic maker. You have to be forward-looking, but you also have to be a scientist in questioning your assumptions. Be rigorous. Be experimental. Right? For all the stuff we've heard today, the people who do the experiments, you fail often, you fail quick. Those are the ones who tend to get stuff right. There's a great study by some Stanford professors. They divided a class into 2 parts. One group had to submit something every single week. The other group had to submit 1 project at the end and it had to be final. So the group that submitted something every single week, didn't matter what quality it was, but they just had to submit something. The final one, the one who did the final one with just only 1 submission, they didn't have to submit anything until the last week. Who do you think did the better submission? But judged by an independent panel, the one who designed for perfect or the one who did something every week? What do you think? The one that did something every week, right? Because they had to refine and iterate, refine and iterate, refine and iterate. Designing for perfect, we can't design for perfect anymore. And we have technology that allows us to get over that, right? And it also focus on the human problem. And I'll tell you a story about this. This is from Serial Innovators by Abby Griffin. If you think about this just conceptually as how a product moves from idea to market. So first you identify the opportunity, then you get some project acceptance. Okay, yes, let's work on this idea, let's do something, and then let's get versions out into official launch. Okay. You might need a skill set of somebody who's an inventor. Maybe they have some technical skills, they have some creativity to understand the market, understand the need. And this is particularly in large organizations, not necessarily small startups, but could be the same, because you may have an idea in a startup and it may have the same thing. Then you need somebody who has political savviness, somebody who's a champion for this particular idea who's going to make it happen. And then you need some kind of implementer. These are the skill sets you need to get the project and product out the door. Now, a serial innovator is what Abby Griffin calls them. They're actually somebody who can do all of those. Many organizations, especially large organizations, they have specialists. They have somebody who is really good at this, then they hand off the project. Then they hand off the project, right? So when the serial innovator can be part of the whole thing, that's huge. And having the mindset, so finding talent that can help think like this and think about the longer picture is really helpful. And think about that Venn diagram that you probably have seen from many design thinking type of structures, people, business, and technology. Is it desirable? Is it viable? Is it going to make us money? And do we have the technology to support it? And I wrote a little bit of a book on it, Design Sprint, similar kind of thing. How do we blend the scientific method and the design process into an agile framework, right? Agile is a philosophy of people over process. You can find it there. And actually, it has been translated to Polish. I have been told by O'Reilly it is been licensed in Poland. And ultimately, this comes down to really two things. Is your company focusing on making people want things or making things people want? Because in a lot of organizations, they've got this product that they've invested in, and they want people to just buy more of our stuff. We got more users. We need more time, spend more time in our app. Have more users use our app. Where's the focus for you? Are you focusing on that? Or are you focusing on trying to find the things that actually people need and want? That's where you focus on the human solution. Companies that do that are the companies that typically drive towards innovative results. So ultimately it comes down to really 4 observations from working in Innovation Center, from working in startups, from working in large enterprises. I've worked in probably all of them or consulted for all of them. I've really noticed a few different things. Firstly, you got to have some kind of tension, but it's creative tension. And that forces you to be brutally honest about what you're trying to do and have mixed viewpoints in the room. The second one is, how do you be agile? How do you change quickly, pivot, and iterate, whether you're big or small? Doesn't matter if you're Oracle, IBM. And the other thing is, can you learn fast? It's not just about the organization's ability to change, it's the organization's ability to learn. Your ability, your individual ability to learn how to learn will be your best skill to take you into the 21st century. Learning how to learn is important because the technologies are going to change, and they're only going to change faster and faster as we continue. So your ability to learn new technologies and adapt them and bring them into your organization will be critical. And give people space. Space to experiment, space to fail. Right? There's lots of OKRs that people have to meet many times, but what happens if you don't meet them? Are you fired? You didn't get your bonus? Where's that acceptance for failing? Right? And gives people space to collaborate. Just not only digital and mental space, but physical space too. And the last thing is that designer and scientist mindset, really focusing on the people problem. Because as I mentioned earlier with color, Bill just focused on the technology. Ben Kaufman was focusing on a wrong problem. He didn't solve the right problem. He solved a problem for makers. He didn't solve a problem for consumers. His business model of trying to help people with quirky, with Ben, the one I'm referring to, he was trying to create tons and tons of products a year rather than just 1 or 2 products a year and make them really, really well. So focus on a people problem. And yeah, just to circle back on that NUMMI plant. So maybe you know about this, maybe you don't, but it was bought in 2010 by Tesla. So maybe they're this hybrid new organization that we can think about. So with that, I thank you very much for indulging me and listening, and happy to answer any questions. This slide deck is here at this bit.ly link. Feel free to reach out on Twitter, shoot me a note. I'm happy to chat about this, and hopefully I've provoked you a little bit to think about how these dynamics happen in organizations. This wasn't a how-to on how to do everything differently. It's not a stepwise approach, but hopefully provoke you to think about things to take away from today. So thank you very much.